can do it. Does it? If I just click on here. Should. I can do it. Okay. Cool. Okay. So, yeah, my format's very different. So, imagine a world where misinformation cannot get a foothold in people's minds, and where every problem is met with innovation, and where rational thought is a dominant characteristic of every society. This world is possible. It is possible if every person on Earth was a critical thinker. And so today, I'm not simply presenting my learning and research over the past few months, but I'm advocating for a change in how we teach our students, our future generation, to think. We live in a rapidly changing world. We're inundated with data and opinions, and we're surrounded by misinformation on all sides. And we face complex global issues as a society, and we still have to make a wise decision about what we're going to eat for dinner tonight. And so critical thinking becomes much more than a convenience or a luxury or an advantage in the job market, but it's a necessity. Today, I want to share what I've learned about what critical thinking is, why it's so important, and how to teach students to become critical thinkers by sharing about my research process over the past semester. And so, first, what even is critical thinking? First, the word critical might conjure up in your mind the image of a cynical old lady who is telling you to, straighten your posture and, have a firmer handshake and tuck in your shirt and tie your shoes tight and wear a belt and speak louder and more clearly and sit up straight and keep your chin up and stop being on your phone so much and go to sleep earlier. And for goodness sake, stop slouching. But critical thinking is not this kind of criticism. It's not cynical or negative. The exact definition of critical thinking has been debated by experts for many years, but I think it's most aptly defined as this: the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information that's gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. And that's a lot. So, more simply put, critical thinking is the ability to take in the grand amounts of data that we receive every day, and there's a lot of ways to receive this data these days, and to figure out what is useful and what isn't, what to believe and what not to believe, what is fact and what's mere opinion. And so critical thinking is the active process of looking at things from multiple perspectives and asking questions and then concluding what's logically best. Daniel Willingham is a cognitive scientist who has devoted much of his career to studying and writing about critical thinking, what it is and what it means for the classroom and how to teach it. He wrote a fantastic book about critical thinking that I cannot recommend enough. On the very first page of his book, he notes that people are naturally curious, but we are not naturally good thinkers. Unless the cognitive conditions are right, we will avoid thinking. And so I want to spend some time exploring the implications of this principle before discussing the practical application of teaching critical thinking skills. Your brain can do many things, but thinking is actually not one of the things that it does best. When you compare thinking with the ability to see or to move, your thinking is slow and effortful and even uncertain. To illustrate what I mean by this, I want you to try and solve this puzzle. In an empty room, you have a candle, some thumbtacks, and a box of matches. The goal is to get the lit candle 5 feet off the ground, and you've already tried melting some of the wax on the bottom and sticking it to the wall, but that was ineffective. How can you get the candle, the lit candle, to be 5 feet off the ground without having to hold it there? Typically, I would give you several minutes to think about this, but most people are unable to solve it within about 10 minutes. But my point about how your brain works will be just as clear if I just reveal the answer to the problem now. You simply dump out the matches and use the thumbtacks to pin the box to the wall, and then you can put your lit candle on your newly designed platform. So this puzzle illustrates a couple things about how our brains work. First, this puzzle illustrates that our thinking is slow. Like I said, most people it takes about 10 to 15 minutes before they can solve the puzzle, even though the solution to the puzzle is not especially difficult. And another example is when you arrive at your friend's house for the first time, you don't think, there's some green stuff on the ground, probably grass, but it could be some other kind of ground cover. We'll have to test it to be sure. And what's that rough brown object sticking up out of the ground? A fence, perhaps? But what is it made of? Is it made out of wood, or is it made out of that fake synthetic material that they make these days? And no, it's ridiculous. Like, you don't think like that when you arrive at your friend's house. You take in the whole scene in an instant. The grass, the fence, the decorations, the flower beds in a glance. And so in comparison, our thinking systems they do not instantaneously process things like our visual system can. And so therefore our thinking is slow. Second, our thinking is effortful. You don't have to try very hard to see things or to imagine things in your mind's eye. But your thinking takes concentration. You can do multiple other things while you're taking in visual information, but you can't think about something else while you're working on, say, a math problem, because you're thinking about the math problem. So why did I spend all this time talking about how your brain works, you might be wondering? Well, that's a good question, and it indicates that you're critically evaluating what I have to say. See, understanding a bit of how our brain works helps us as educators and as future educators to support good thinking in our students. If you know how thinking works, it can in turn help you to make thinking easier for your students. You can teach your students how the mind works so that they can become aware of how they think. And then once you and your students both know how your brain works, then you can work together to improve your thinking. This is called metacognition, or thinking about your thinking. And metacognition is an essential critical thinking skill. Let's also consider a super oversimplified model of how the brain works. This is also in Willingham's book that I mentioned earlier. Here you can see that there's two main ways that our brains work: your working memory and your long-term memory. Your working memory is what you're actively thinking about in a particular moment. And your long-term memory is what stores your memories that you can recall at a later time. And like I said, this is a super oversimplified version of how the brain works, which is so complex we don't even fully know how it works, just that it does. But here's an example of how your working memory and long-term memory interact. If I asked you to imagine a pirate standing on a pirate ship and next to a pile of gold, almost certainly all of you can do that. And I'm sure you have an image of a pirate standing on a pirate ship standing next to a pile of gold in your head right now. It's your working memory that's holding that image in your brain while I'm talking. But your long-term memory is pulling relevant background information to make the most detailed and accurate picture that you possibly can. Notice that I didn't ask you to imagine the pirate wearing pirate clothes, but you almost certainly included that detail. The image of those clothes is due to your long-term memory pulling relevant background information about pirates. And so it's clear to conclude that to think, and to think critically, we need relevant background knowledge. You can't think about something that you don't know about. However, background knowledge alone isn't enough to cut it, because we can have all the background information possible, but if our working memory is overloaded with information, then we can struggle to recall other relevant information and think critically about it. Let me illustrate what I mean. If I asked you to find one commonality between a pirate and a flamingo, your long-term memory immediately begins surfacing information about pirates and flamingos, and then your working memory starts comparing how they might be similar. Maybe that they both live on or near water. But on the other hand, if I asked you to find one commonality between a pirate, a flamingo, a snowman, a tree, a computer, and a cheetah, your working memory is going to be overloaded simply trying to remember the 6 items that I listed, let alone begin pulling relevant background information and start comparing them. And so it's crucial that we as educators become masters at helping students recall relevant information about a topic without overloading them with ideas. We need to become experts at walking this line between relevant background information and a reasonable cognitive level. Now, you might be wondering at this point, and I really hope you are, how do I teach students to think critically? How do I operate within that balance? This is where I want to share more about my research process. The thought of doing research can be scary. It can be intimidating and overwhelming to think about poring over research and articles from many years. But I'm here to say it isn't all that bad. When I was put up to the challenge of doing a semester's load of research over whatever topic I desired, and to do it in whatever fashion I desired, and then present my research in whatever style I desired, I felt kind of overwhelmed. However, I had all the tools that I needed. I just had to use them. I saw that I needed to present my research in any format that I desired, and I thought, why not write an article that would benefit teachers all over the nation? After concluding what my end goal was, I approached it from a similar angle that I would approach any of my other essays and papers that I would do for my other classes. I simply just started learning everything that I could. No joke, my first Google search was critical thinking. I just let Google bring up whatever it wanted. I started to see what people had to say about critical thinking. And what I found was that everyone thought critical thinking was one of the most important things that a student could ever learn, but that they didn't think it was being taught in schools very well at all. They noted how everyone says that critical thinking is one of the school system's main jobs, but it wasn't actually happening in reality. This was the key observation in what I was reading. Everyone wants it, but no one has it. And so I asked myself, why? Why is this happening? What is stopping students from learning critical thinking skills? So I slowly narrowed down my searches, and this provided my research base for my actual article. Once I discovered that there were distinct causes that were inhibiting critical thinking in students, I knew that this is what I needed to write about. And so I started to get really invested and interested in finding the solution. I found multiple themes across all the research literature that showed that the most common inhibitors to critical thinking were these: an overemphasis on memorization, inadequate integration of cross-disciplinary skills, inadequate integration of time constraints for rigid curriculum, and an over-reliance on technology. And the other one that's missing, this is supposed to be absence of mass integration. So I investigated each of those ideas as much as possible and learned everything that I could about them. And now it's important to note that it's only at this time in my research process that I wrote an outline for my article. I've been doing hours of research and learning before finally making an outline for my article. And so then it was at that point I could begin the writing process, which took a couple of weeks. And I am still in the final hours of writing it, but I cannot wait to have a finalized product that I can present to teachers, especially science teachers, all across the nation, and help them to teach critical thinking skills to their students. Now, I won't hold you in suspense any longer on the actual pragmatic, practical information that you need to know. But I wanted to discuss my research process first because for two reasons. One, it gives me a measure of credibility with you as I begin to talk about the practical information that you need to know. And two, because I want to ease your mind about potentially doing the same thing someday. I hope this presentation encourages you and inspires you to be able to do the same thing on a topic that you're passionate about. So finally, how do we teach critical thinking skills to students? Here are the most practical things that you can start doing today to promote critical thinking skills in your classroom. Quick note also, these are especially relevant for science teachers, but they can easily be applied in any classroom. First, as we all know, memorization has limited benefits. However, we do need to practice skills that we learn. A good pianist is not good because she can sit down and just play any grand piano solo that she ever wants to, but she's good because she practices her scales every single day. She knows them by heart, but she still practices them every day. Your students will never be good at multiplication tables or Punnett squares or the traditional scientific method if they don't practice using those skills. So don't ask your students to simply memorize the multiplication table or whatever, but have them practice multiplication tables from time to time. They will benefit from this regular practice. So the first big practical piece of advice that I have for critical thinking is to practice the skills that you already know. Practice makes progress, and our education system has strayed away from practice because it got really scared of memorization for a while. And there's a time and place for memorization, even if it is few and far between, but practice is always necessary. And this goes for all disciplines and subject areas, but especially in STEM subjects. Secondly, we need to get our students to read and write literally as much as humanly possible. Reading is invaluable, and some of y'all in here already know that and preach that message yourselves, but reading exposes children to more facts and a broader vocabulary than virtually any other activity, which can promote efficient, deeper thinking skills. But the other aspect is to get students writing. This this is the most practical and biggest takeaway that I have personally taken from all of my research this semester. We must get students writing. Students cannot fake their way through assignments or masquerade as if they have knowledge when they have to write about a topic. They have to express deeper thoughts when they write, so they can't just check a box or hope they found the pattern and the answer key to the multiple choice quiz. The best way to teach people to think critically is to teach them to write. There's no difference between writing and thinking. In fact, it's the most powerful weapon that you could possibly give someone to be successful in life. Being articulate is the most innovative thing that you could possibly be. And now, some teachers do expect their students to write, and that's great, but it's not complete. Often those very same teachers never tell their students why they need to write. Why are you writing? Because you need the grade. But no, you're writing because you need to learn to think. Because thinking makes you act effectively in this world. And so we need to communicate how writing benefits their thinking habits and how writing truly is thinking itself. You just simply record it on paper. And so I'm convinced we need to design assignments, homework, and tests so that students will inevitably and unavoidably think about the meaning of things, which is something that must be done in both reading and writing. And so we need to have our students read and write as much as literally possible. Next, simply do puzzles with your class. Doing the occasional puzzle is super beneficial for thinking. Whether that's the Wordle or a Sudoku puzzle or a crossword puzzle or any unique riddles or anything that you come across, or the puzzle that I had you do moments earlier. Do these puzzles with your students. They're super engaging because most of the time they're designed to grab the listener's attention and track them until they solve it. And so not only will your students engage with them, but it also requires them to think critically about the problem at hand. And these are exactly the sort of skills that we want to teach students to practice so that they can apply them when they have to do a lab experiment or a complicated math problem. And so do puzzles every once in a while. Switching gears in my advice a little bit, I want to talk about how to plan for critical thinking. I talked briefly about how to assess thinking and promote student thinking through writing and puzzles and practice. But now I want to address you as a teacher and how to plan an environment of critical thinking before you hit the classroom floor. First, think carefully about your attention grabbers. Maybe you want to engage your student, Brittany, and Brittany's really interested in Instagram. And so you decide to make your lesson attention grabber about Instagram because it'll engage her and hopefully everyone else in the classroom. However, my question is, will this attention grabber actually cause her to think about the food chain, or is she going to be thinking about how she hasn't checked Instagram yet today, and how her friend messaged her about a problem last night in her DMs, and oh, someone liked her comment on a post, and she really wants to check all the updates from her family and friends, and look how far away we are from the food chain. It seems far more likely to me that this attention grabber would cause your students to think about something that's more immediately relevant to them, like Instagram, than about the actual content that you have planned for that day. And so just think and plan carefully about your attention grabbers and what students will actually be thinking about during that time. And this leads perfectly into my next point, which is really just the same point. You need to review each of your lesson plans in terms of what the student is likely to think about. So what I mean by that is, what will your students be thinking about as you show them a video about genetics, or lecture on the proper technique for solving Punnett squares, or demonstrating and modeling how to set up a science experiment? Will they be thinking about what you're doing, or will they be thinking about something else? Does the video that you showed them have interesting music or an animation that will ultimately distract them from the content? Or did you crack a joke while setting up the experiment and now your students are just thinking about how else they can joke about the experiment? I'm just saying be cautious. I'm not saying that any of those things are inherently bad or that they immediately inhibit critical thinking. I'm just saying that you need to be careful and you need to review your lesson plans so that you can manage what your students are thinking about throughout the whole lesson. And the last thing I want to say about this is that critical thinking, by definition, is about comparing and contrasting ideas. So when you teach literally anything, think about whatever content area you're studying and the last lesson that you taught. When you teach that lesson, try to provide multiple examples. And then when you provide those examples, ask your students to compare those ideas. This is quite literally critical thinking. This is one of the most direct things that you can have your students do to promote critical thinking, other than writing, like I mentioned earlier. And it's to have students literally compare ideas and then discuss the similarities and the differences, the strengths and weaknesses, the pros and cons, or whatever. And so have your students compare and contrast multiple examples, and you will literally be providing the space that your students need to think critically. And now, absolutely none of this matters if you aren't convinced that it's important for students to learn critical thinking skills. Remember what I said at the beginning? Imagine a world where misinformation cannot get a foothold in people's minds, and where every problem is met with innovation, and where rational thought is the dominant characteristic of every society. See, with critical thinking skills, this world is truly possible. Innovation, truth, and rational thought are the exact benefits that critical thinking has to offer. And you know what? I am fully convinced that we can do this. Notice there's not an ounce of doubt in my face. And that's an important part of leadership, that the leader never once for a moment doubts the capacity of his followers to do the thing that he dreams to do. And I know that we can do this. I'm convinced that every single one of our students can think critically. See, if I thought, if only we could get some of our students to think critically, if we could move that 5% to 6%, then all of our problems would go away. But how would you walk, and how would you talk, and what would you do if you thought, if only we could get the 5% to move to 6%, then all of our problems will be solved? But everyone is a critical thinker. Everyone can be a critical thinker. They just haven't learned how to do it yet. And so my version of success in this area of critical thinking is not about the wealth or the fame or the power that we'll receive from critical thinking. That's not my version of success at all. The way that I measure success is about how many shining eyes there are around me. The more shining eyes you have around you is the measure to which you are a successful teacher. And in those shining eyes, I hope that someday you and I can look in those shining eyes and see your students thinking critically. And so I hope that our future can be as bright as the shining eyes of our students when they experience the joy of learning that comes through critical thinking. Thank you.